Okay, so tomorrow we're going to be working on exponents and their roots. And just to review, this is wrong. We have 8 to the second power, and hopefully you remember that that just means 8 times 8, because 8 to the second means 2 8s, and 8 times 8 is 64. And then we're going to start doing what's called the inverse. And the inverse, or taking the square of something, is taking its square root. One of the concepts we need to understand is the square and square root are the inverse, or they can undo each other. If I want to undo 8 squared, I can take the square root of 64, and that gives me 8. So using that concept, I can figure out what x is. I can do that because I know to figure out what x squared is, I can do the inverse. And the inverse of squaring something is taking its square root. So I know that if I take the square root of x squared, and remember what you do to one side of the left, you have to do it to the side of the right, I can take the square root of this and figure out my value of x. So I know the square root of x squared is x. Just like you knew the square root of 64 was 8, because 8 times 8 is 64. Well, x times x is x squared, so the square root of x squared would make it x. And then we just need to find the square root of 729. So on your calculators, you would need to take the square root of 729. So your square root on your calculator is right above your x squared button. And again, that's because it's the inverse. It's in blue, so we hit second, excuse me, square root, and then 729. And so that would give me a value of 27. So that tells me that 27 times 27 is 729. So therefore, the square root of 729 is 27. And that's how I would solve that equation there. We're also going to get into some higher roots. Like we have 8 to the third power, which is 8 times 8 times 8. And you should know on your calculators, if we want to find out what 8 to the third power is, we have to use our what we call the little caret, which is the up button, and that is 8 to the third power. I just hit enter, and that tells me that's 512. All right, and now the same thing works with this. To undo the square of something, I took the square root. To undo the cube of something, I would have to take the cube root. And so that looks like a square root sign, but we put a little 3 there. And that 3 means that you're multiplying the number by itself 3 times. So if we took, oops, creeper fell. If we took the cube root of 512, we already know it's 8, because 8 times itself 3 times is 512. But if I didn't know that, I would go to my calculator, and I would put in 3 for the cube root. Then I would go to math. Actually, they have cube root here. I could just use that then. Or I can use this x, because that means I can put anything in for that. And then I put in 512. And that would tell me it was 8. Or, obviously, that would have been a little bit easier just to do the third root. So it looks like our calculator has functions for the square root and the cube root. However, if I needed the fourth root of something, then and which you are going to do tomorrow, you would take 4, put in the number 4, go to math, then go down to 5 where it says x and then the radical sign, and hit enter, and oops. And then we put in whatever we wanted the fourth root of, okay? So something else that we're going to be learning is how to write this in a fractional form. All right, so just to finish this one up, sorry, we would say that that is 8. 8 times 8 times 8 times 8 is 512, so the cube root of 512 is 8. We're also going to be looking at how we can write this in fraction form. And how I can do that is I can take 5 12ths, and right now that is to the first power. So I make this 5 12ths to the 1/3 power. because of the 3 and the 1. If you go to your calculator and you put in 512 and you raise it, I'm going to put it in parentheses because it's more than one digit, the 1 third, look what happens. The answer is 8, just as the cube root of 512 is 8. So we're going to be working with that a little bit also. Same thing is if I had up here, if I had the square root of 64, I could write that as 64. No, this is the square root, which means it's to the second, right? And that's to the first power. I could put 64 to the 1/2. So instead of writing the square root of 64, I could write 64 to the 1/2. And just to prove it to you, if we did 64 and raised it to the 1/2, see what happens if you don't put parentheses around it. Did I get the right answer? No. So let's try that again, but we'll do to the 1/2 like this, and then I get my proper answer of 8. So the square root of 64 is 8, and 64 to the 1/2 is also 8. So several things I want you to remember. When you have something to the second power, you can square root it to do the opposite effect. So 8 squared is 64. The square root of 64 brings you back to 8. So it's kind of a full circle thing. Okay, so this is to show you that square rooting something or taking a radical of something can solve for a variable. And then we're also going to get into cube roots and fourth roots and fifth roots and even sixth roots. So we need to understand that when something's to that power, it's that number times itself that many times. And then again, to do the inverse, if this is to the third power, I want to do the third root. If this was to the fourth power, I would do the fourth root here. If this was to the fifth power, I would do the fifth root here. And then also to be able to write these radical signs in fraction form. And again, you would just put it, whatever the exponent is, what's inside the radical sign goes in the numerator, and the root you're trying to find becomes the denominator. So that's it. So your homework tonight is going to be let's see. Your homework tonight will be in your skills book, page 409 to 410. You do 1 through 18. It's very simple. It should take you maybe 5 minutes to do. And I think in Minecraft, the creeper always explodes. So, good night.